Well, happy to be here. When Chris was talking about things used to happen a little more readily on the Hill, I'm reminded of the Queen in Alice in Wonderland who said, I always try to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. So maybe it's still possible to make some progress on the Hill. Going to talk about motivations in supply chain, and coming from a couple of perspectives. Pure Strategies works with a variety of companies, and these are some of the examples of them. We work on their supply chain. We work on sustainable planning for the company, how they align their sustainability strategy with their basic business strategy, and we work with them on the products they're producing, how to make those products more sustainable. As you can see, it's a wide variety of different kinds of companies. There are large, there are small. Walmart is the largest of those companies. With Walmart, we've worked on their sustainability index. How many people are familiar with that? So the sustainability index, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, several years ago, Walmart helped found the Sustainability Consortium. They don't own it, but they set it up, and there are now over 100 companies in that. And those companies work sector by sector to develop sustainability-based questions to try to resolve hotspots in the supply chain. Social hotspots, chemical hotspots, greenhouse gases, water, whatever. So we've helped in the development of many of those supply chain scenarios and questions. And the bottom line is, and this is the beginning of the kind of pressure that's really beginning to transform things, is that every company selling to Walmart will ultimately have to answer a set of questions which will be scored every year on their products and the extent to which they're making progress in terms of sustainability. And buyers for Walmart, who obviously always focus on dollars and cents issues and on product quality issues, are also beginning to assess those companies in terms of sustainability, and the buyers will to some degree be assessed on that. So that's one of the perspectives I come from. And we've also, by the way, recently done, I just wanted to mention this for people who are interested, a product, looking at product sustainability. We interviewed over 100 companies worldwide in terms of the characteristics in terms of sustainability they're looking at, and we're seeing some very positive results. We're seeing real changes, I think, in the corporate world. The other piece that I want to talk about, because one of the things that comes up no matter which sector you're dealing with, is confidential business information, the availability of data, the secrecy in product data, and so forth. How do you get past that? And over the last 2 years, the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council, which is a group of about 100 companies which work to try to promote green chemistry, has been focusing on how do you deal with CBI. There's some really important positive things about CBI. There are also some problems and limitations. How do we deal with that? So those are the two focuses. So what are the major things? I think one of the major changes, and start with my experience on the Hill. As Chris said, I was on the Hill at a point where you could actually get some environmental legislation done that was positive. Obviously, that's less the case these days with a vengeance. In spite of that, a lot is happening. Why is it happening? Because of other drivers. In terms of our experience, I would say that it is the customer in the supply chain, near the end of the supply chain, who now has the greatest leverage and the greatest impact on bringing about change. That's where the potential is. And the combined efforts of those companies and of NGOs working with those companies in collaboration or something and pushing as well is where a lot of the action is right now. So we're going to talk about that, the right balance in CBI, and the importance to me of the LEED Materials Initiative is that it fits into this ongoing movement, which I think is going to begin to transform things. When we talk about supply chain, sometimes we have an image of something that's very easy to get a handle on and assess. But if you take a look at this, this is just for a laptop computer, and you can see these materials come from everywhere. The sourcing of materials, the manufacturing, the assembling. As you can see here, as you'd expect, a concentration in Asia and in China. And sometimes it's very hard to know even where the original materials are coming from. It's even more true if you're talking about, this is just for a white sheet. So you're not talking about anything that involves dyes and coloring, which is one of the most environmentally impactful activities in that whole supply chain, and also tends to leave residues on the products you buy, which after you wash, they're gone, but in the first, you get irritation or whatever from that. Having a handle on this supply chain is an enormous task. Knowing where things come from, who introduced what materials, do the people who made up the magic potent, which is the perfect dye color, even know what the chemicals are and what their attributes are. So where this focuses, I think, is even a major supply chain manager like Walmart doesn't have a handle when you get far enough back into the supply chain on everything that's going on. You may remember, it was about a year and a half ago when the factory collapsed in Bangladesh and so many people were killed, and Walmart was surprised to discover that some of their products were being made in that factory, as were, I think, a number of other companies, large brands. That's part of the problem of managing the supply chain and having information about it. So when we talk about driving sustainability through the supply chain, it's a huge task. This is a map of just Nike, have over 700 factories worldwide, and we're just talking about first tier. That is the companies that deal, factories that deal with Nike directly. We're not getting back to all those chains before anything ever comes to those factories. So in terms of what are the pressures that are beginning to make change here, I think you look at four principal things. First, there are regulations. It may be hard to realize if you're looking at Congress as your main source of direction, but there's a regulation internationally. REACH has enormous importance. And so that's still a player, even though lesser than we might like it to be. There are the customer pressures, which I think are critical right now. Stakeholder pressures, NGOs, investors, and groups that are working with or pushing companies. And finally, increasing consumer health concerns. That tends to be sporadic. It's not a continuous pressure and tends to build off of things that NGOs deliver, but those are all critical factors. This interplay of these different factors is what will bring about change, and I think that's an important thing to think about. It's not one or the other in isolation. So just to look at the regulations for a minute. Mention REACH, obviously that's an important one in terms of chemicals having a real impact. China has a REACH. Of course, the problem there is enforcement. You can have laws in the books, and what happens is important. In terms of the U.S., I put in EPA and FDA, and there are certainly specific things. If you think in terms of phthalates and lead and things in children's toys, CPSC has taken action on that after one of the few things Congress did pass. But interestingly enough, if you look at the upper left hand there, the AAFA, the Footwear and Apparel Association, publishes every 6 months a compiled list of all the most stringent regulations anywhere in the world. So if there's a rule in Oregon or a rule in England or whatever, all those are compiled here, and that becomes a restricted substance list that they recommend to their members, and many of the apparel companies follow that. Now, in a single year, from 2012 to 2013, there were over 100 changes. So one of the questions becomes, do you want to be just catching up with all those changes, or do you want to take a proactive position? And those are initiatives that are important. And again, if you look at something like the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, that's one of their goals, to get ahead of the game, to really drive sustainability. There are regulations that matter in terms of transparency of chemicals. And for example, the state of Washington passed a law and now has, you can go to their website and see any chemicals of a list of 60-some toxic chemicals that are in children's products that are sold in Washington. And a lot of companies had to do a lot of work to answer the basic question that Washington required them to answer. If you have a shampoo for a child, a toy for a child, whatever it is, you have to let the state know, and you will, and they're pursuing those who don't respond if you have any of those chemicals, and is published publicly. There's always Prop 65 from California. That's obviously always been effective in forcing companies to be public. And the blue lines there are the number of suits, legal actions against companies that failed. And it doesn't have to be the state. Anyone, you, me, anyone else, can go after a company which fails to indicate, to be transparent about the materials in their products. So the key thing is the demand pull from the customers for the data. That's one of the drivers right now, whether it's through something like the Health Product Declaration or through Walmart's Sustainability Index. That's a huge driver. And there's an interplay between specific restrictions on chemicals. I mean, a lot of the state restrictions are almost chemical by chemical. You focus on a particular phthalate or you focus on flame retardants. But the impact is to force people to look more seriously at their supply chain, and it drums into the consciousness of someone who's looking at this from a company, you know, I don't want to wait for the next one. As I develop a new product, I want to be sure that we're not subjecting ourselves to any of these problems. So what are some of the mechanisms that companies use to deal with getting this information? Walmart doesn't get all the chemical information directly. They use a company called The Works, which is now part of UL Environment, which gathers information for any formulated product, shampoos, glues, cleaners, anything like that. They gather complete comprehensive data from the company under a non-disclosure agreement, and then they provide Walmart with sort of the top line hazard. Is there anything here that's going to cause a legal problem? And The Works is just focusing on legal compliance. It can go beyond that. Walmart got into this because they got caught with a major fine for having hazardous waste and things they were throwing out, which they didn't even know was there. So back almost a decade ago, they started using Works. Works does this not just for Walmart now, but for a lot of retailers. So there's a large database. But Works is also looking at, and Walmart encouraged this, so it hasn't gone very far in Walmart, taking that same data, you can do calculations as to what the basic sustainability measure, what the hazard level against any of the list of hazards you want to focus on are in that product. So beyond knowing it's legal, you can also get an assessment using the same data the companies are inputting. It doesn't require anything new, of what the sustainability or the hazard level, the safety of the product is. What are some of the reasons companies want to do this? Seagate's a great example. Seagate used to gather data, spreadsheets, whatever, and get data from companies up to a certain level. Now, this is not formulated products. We tend to think the easiest place to do this is with formulated products where you have a liquid, but here you've got solid products. Seagate, I'm sure most of you know, they make hard drives and things like that for computers, and they require all their suppliers, they started several years ago, to give complete breakout of all the chemicals in materials and products they're buying. And there was some initial resistance, but the suppliers ultimately all agreed. Now, the reason Seagate did this was because they didn't want to just be responding, here's a new regulation, do we have any of this in our products? Who produces it? How do we get a handle on this? They wanted to be ahead of the game, either for regulations or for customer requirements. And one of the big tests came when the REACH, new chemicals under REACH were named a few years ago. It took Seagate 15 minutes to assess what chemicals were in their products, another 2 days to determine, going back through their supply chain, what could be done about it. And they were able to tell their customers almost immediately, you're going to be in complete compliance with REACH, here's how we know. So it's getting ahead of the game, not having that sort of top red line of these bursts of costs where you suddenly have to assess, whoops, what are we doing here? How do we catch up? Which is what most companies had to do. But the bottom green line, which is we've got all this information, we can manage more effectively. It's a management and product issue as well, and a safety issue. So there are lots of other examples. We've been working with 7th generation since we started the company 16 years ago. Everyone here know about 7th generation, hopefully? Yes. There's sort of, I shouldn't say the green Procter & Gamble, but anyway, that kind of product area where they're guaranteed there won't be any hazardous materials in their products. SC Johnson has a questionnaire on materials, and they have their toxicologists go through whatever is provided by companies to them. If you refuse to provide information to SC Johnson, they say, fine, you get a 0, and that will probably be detrimental in whether we buy much of your material or not. So there are incentives, and leveraging those incentives. Again, let's get back to that issue of customer demand. 7th generation demands that you provide all the information. You want to sell through 7th generation, to 7th generation, you have to provide that material, that information. And that's a huge driver. Seventh generation isn't a large company, but larger and larger companies are doing very much the same thing. And that's what's going to begin to drive change. Now, it isn't just getting the information. I said before that it's the interplay between what the restrictions are and what the information flow is. And so you see both Target and Walmart now enforcing new changes in the system. Walmart, without saying exactly what they are publicly, has 10 chemicals or chemical families which it doesn't want to see in products going down the road here. And it's not a prohibition. You can include those materials, those ingredients in your products, but it will be scored negatively over time. By 2018, if you haven't gotten those materials out of your products, you can still sell them, and you can have like a cigarette pack with a skull and crossbones. It won't be that dramatic, which says this chemical is in this product, and that'll be on the shelf when you sell it at Walmart. I can't imagine many companies are going to want to have that. So it's a huge driver for change on those products. And there's also a scoring system for Target now. The interesting thing is in both cases, we don't really know publicly what's going on because Walmart hasn't said what the chemicals are except to their suppliers, and Target hasn't explained exactly how their scoring system works. But the fact is for their suppliers, the suppliers who have those materials know, and they are responding. So finally, one of the things in terms of the supply chain, remember that long supply chain for just a white sheet. This is an example from Levi Strauss. Most companies regard their supply chain as confidential. They won't tell you who they're buying from. Walmart generally won't tell you who their suppliers for their own brands are going back into the supply chain. Levi Strauss and Nike several years ago made another decision. They published the complete list of all their hundreds of suppliers worldwide, their direct suppliers. And more recently, they're requiring, and it's available on their website, you can go and look at it, they're requiring those companies, those suppliers, to state for all of a series of critical chemicals, 11 chemicals and chemical families, what the intake is, of the use of those chemicals is, and what the discharge of those chemicals is. It serves two purposes. One, it means you're not going to see those chemicals in their products. When you get the clothing, it's not going to have one of these chemicals on it because the goal is to be at zero by 2020, both in use and in what's left on clothing. And secondly, it's having an impact where those factories are. We're at the end of the supply chain. We see all the products that come through. Most of the manufacturing no longer is here, unfortunately. It's elsewhere where it often is not well controlled. And so what this does is drives two things: better products and better safety for people where they live, where the products are made. This isn't done company by company, and I think one of the key things here, the effort of Levi's, Nike, H&M, and many other companies is through something called the ZDHC, Zero Discharge Hazardous Chemicals Group, which is a collaboration of companies that have agreed to eliminate these 11 chemical families by 2020. And jointly working together, saying who their suppliers are, getting the same message to all their mutual suppliers, working together on inspections and gathering data, has a force which no large company, whether it's a Nike or a Levi's, can have individually. And the same is true in these other areas. The Higg Index is an index which was developed by Nike and donated free to all the rest of the industry through the Sustainable Apparel Coalition to make both those chemical assessments and other sustainability assessments of products. The Sustainability Consortium, how many of you have heard of the Sustainability Consortium? A few. Back about 7 years ago, Walmart set up the Sustainability Consortium with the goal of being able to assess the sustainability of every product Walmart sells. Think about that for a minute. And so the goal was to set this up under two universities, University of Arkansas, Arizona State University. Companies join, and they're part of an effort with NGOs, with government people, to design how to respond to the hotspots, the social hotspots and environmental hotspots, back through the supply chain. Where can you have the leverage? And develop assessment questions, and then in Walmart's case at least, strategies for dealing with those problems back in the supply chain. And the buyers are bought in, sometimes beyond the individual products, because there are thousands, tens of thousands. I have no idea how many actually products that Walmart sells, is looking across product areas and finding their commonalities. And we can actually drive change by doing something across the board. So again, it's the customer driving things back through the supply chain. And the question is, what's the incentive? Well, the incentive is to be a market leader, and the incentive is not to be on the, shall we say, the front page of whatever paper Greenpeace decides to advertise on about the toxics in the clothing you're buying. They've done this, as you can see. Levi's was on their hit list. Virtually every clothing brand has been on the hit list. Walmart, not so far, but Walmart's certainly aware of this, and every company that sells clothing is aware of this. So that here you have this, again, this sort of kind of collaboration. Companies that are already leading companies still seeing they've got problems. Greenpeace has done a lot to forge the drive to create the Zero Discharge Hazardous Chemicals Group, which is nonetheless a company's group. It's not a Greenpeace group. So that's one of the things. But the other, and I think the really interesting thing that's been changed if you go back a couple of decades, is the degree to which there's collaborative effort between NGOs and companies. EDF works closely with Walmart on toxic chemicals. Clean Production Action is obviously the generator of green screen, which is, I think, one of the most transformative tools that's out there, and which is also one of the tools that's in the lead materials declaration. GC3, which is a group of companies and NGOs, runs through the University of Massachusetts at Lowell to drive green chemistry. So there are a lot of these combined collaborative efforts, and I think they're key. And as I said before, I think the great thing about the lead material reporting is that it's increasing the critical mass. It's a huge industry. Supply chains that interweave with other supply chains all over the world. And what you're really doing is that as more and more sectors have their own sets of rules, and larger sectors, it's driving this back through the supply chain so that companies at all levels become aware, we can't game this, we can't get around this, and now we have to look at what are the positive things. How do we get benefit out of this? How do we design better products that will have a wider market? So again, that interplay, in this case, just look at something like the green screen from CPA, the work that USGBC is doing with that, EPA's Design for the Environment, which was part of what green screen was based on. Lots of companies using that and responding to it. It's one of those mutual collaborative efforts, and here is EPA doing something which is non-regulatory, but has enormous impact. Design for the Environment, testing products, setting out standards, driving alternatives assessment. So one of the hurdles, obviously, in some of this is confidential business information. It's often looked as a major hurdle, and it's often given as a reason for companies not providing information in the supply chain. In fact, CBI, non-CBI data goes through the supply chain all the time. Again, think in terms of those enormously complex supply chains, and it can be critical to companies that really develop something which is a novel product, a novel green chemical, a novel sustainability product, or others, in their willingness to share information. So what GC3 tackled was, okay, we recognize there are some real values in CBI and CBI claims. Companies need protection for truly innovative materials, and they have an enormous value economically. So how do we deal with trade secrets? How do we deal with their protection, but at the same time push towards transparency so that CBI isn't a blockade? Some of you may know, if you go back several years, a couple decades certainly, at EPA, when EPA was collecting data under TSCA, that they got overwhelmed with CBI claims, and they tended just to sort of accept them. And a lot of them are really dubious claims. So one of the things that's happened at EPA is EPA has tightened up its rules in terms of what can be claimed as CBI. So the question is, what's the interplay between where EPA is and what happens in business-to-business world, which is not governed by regulatory rules per se. So in terms of EPA, the first thing is you have to show that if you were to allow this information out into the public, it would have harmful effects on your competitive position. You have to demonstrate it some way. Second is it can't be disclosed publicly in any way. It used to be that you would see CBI claims for things for which there are patents or MSDSs, which are clearly public documents, publicly available. That doesn't happen much anymore. If it's known outside the company, it has to be under a CDA. And employees have to be bound by CDA. So if an employee leaves your company and goes to your competitor, the information can't go with the employee. And finally, you can't get at it readily through reverse engineering. And the reverse engineering won't get at a lot of things. You can't reverse engineer a tire once it's made, but there are products you can. One of the participants in the GC3 group sent one of her employees out to get a cologne and see if they could determine what the makeup of the cologne was. And he went out and got something called Swiss Army cologne. Who knew there was such a thing? And in 15 minutes, he was able to get the basic parameters of what were in the cologne. He said if he'd spent a day on it, he could have gotten all the proportions. Now, that's a special circumstance. It can't be done all the time. But the whole point is it shouldn't be something that can easily be discovered through analysis. California, with the consumer product regulation, which is the basis for alternative assessment requirements that they're starting to implement, added a couple of provisions to the EPA provisions. And the key one is you cannot claim CBI protection for a hazard trait that you submit to the state, or for any, and this is the key phrase, for any chemical identity information associated with a hazard claim. So if you have a hazard claim, something is carcinogen, a mutagen, endocrine disruptor, whatever it is, you can't hide what that material is. You have to reveal that to the state. There can be exceptions up to the point where something is being covered by a patent. So what happens in terms of business to business? In one of the webinars that our group had, one of the lawyers who discussed CBI claims in supply chain said you have to sort of look at business to business transactions, the Wild West, in terms of the rules for CBI and how it's managed. But in fact, there's some fairly standard things that are in the non-disclosure agreements between companies. And where do companies generally agree it's appropriate to have CBI? During the development of a new product, for obvious reasons, until a product is protected by a patent. So that during that early development and phase where you're marketing the product, you want protection. Non-patentable combinations. You can have something that's made up entirely of known chemicals, but in new ways, different ways that are unusual. You can't necessarily get patent protection for that, but it's still a trade secret. And so you want to be able to keep that protected. And finally, there are companies that simply, for very sensitive information, won't use a patent because they're concerned that even though you have patent protection in the United States, if you have competitors from China and Russia in particular, that patent may not be worth very much. So they will keep it as a trade secret rather than as intellectual property presumptionally legally protected by a patent. So in terms of framework for dealing with this, and this is just a very general skim of some of the things we covered, you look at what the purpose is for requesting information, data collection, security, incentives, and look at CBI in that context. So whether something and how you're going to deal with the supply chain in terms of CBI, you're going to look at what the company's position in the supply chain is. It's going to vary by sector. If you're in a sector which is heavily regulated, you're in a drug sector or something like that, a lot of these questions go away because you're required to provide certain information. On the other hand, if you're in a material product which has very little regulation, these become critical questions. If you're making chairs, they're not going to be heavily regulated under current rules. So it depends what product area, sector area you're in. What's the chemical intensity of the product? what are your analytic capabilities as a company? Can you do the assessments, or can you hire a Talk Services or another group like that to do the assessment for you? And what kind of relationship? The trust relationships are really critical here. If you have trust between yourself and the supplier, some things that are sensitive in one relationship may be less sensitive to you. So those are all issues. So just to look at this table, look down the left side there. The reasons you could be requesting information. First, you're required to get this chemical data by regulation. That's the end of the story. You have to get it. The company has to supply it to you. You may do it in a couple of ways. You can say either, here's a list of chemicals. Do you have any of them? And you get a negative declaration. Or you can demand positively that they provide you information on any of these chemicals if they have them over a certain level. Or if you go to the level of a Seagate or a seventh generation, you can have a requirement they provide you all the information. You'll make the assessment of whether this chemical is there at risk. But still, regulations change the ballgame. The second thing is rules for things like cradle to cradle, the new materials standards, you want scoring under LEED, customer data requirements like a seventh generation requirements. You will tell us everything if you're going to sell through us. There may be product design issues that they're looking at and they want to know what's in there. Those are the issues in terms of why you might want the information, the level of information you request. If you just care about being in compliance, you may not necessarily, if you don't take Seagate's perspective, you may not care about having complete data. If you want to develop a fully green product, then you need that data and make the assessment yourselves, because things which are not regulated obviously can be hazards. We know the regulatory system lags behind our knowledge about hazards that are out there. So companies are at the cutting edge of trying to deal with the hazards, not just with the regulations. So what kind of questions? You can ask for the hazardous ingredients. Is there anything hazardous in the product? If you look at the health product declaration, you know that if a company wants to keep secret some of their ingredients, they can keep the CAS number secret. They can not say specifically what the chemical is, but they do have to say that there's a hazard and what the hazard is. So that's sort of the minimum level. The next is you ask for all ingredients. That's going to get more likely into CBI types of issues. If you start asking process questions, almost certainly. And finally, if you start asking about business relationships, that becomes very sensitive. Some companies, some retailers who want to get information who are sort of in the middle, let's say they're a company like an Office Depot or Staples or something that's in the middle of a supply chain as well as being a retailer, they may want data that they can pass on. But then the question is, if they can't get that data from their supplier under CBI, what do they do if their customer demands it? Well, one of the solutions is to go to another third-party solution like Cradle to Cradle or like Works. We'll talk about that in a minute. But all those questions impact what's going to be considered CBI by your supplier. So what are some of the options? One thing is you can adopt standard widely used formats for requesting information. One of the great things about health product declarations, and someone said to me that there are now over 1,000 health product declarations that have been filed, is that it's the same format, asking the same information. Every supplier can see, here's what the information is, here's the form it's going to have to be provided in. That facilitates communication, facilitates willingness to provide information which otherwise wouldn't flow. And that's happening in several industries now, and it's a major change, a major advantage. The second is third-party sources such as Works and Cradle to Cradle. One of the things that can happen is if your supplier, your first-tier supplier, doesn't have information because they hit a CBI block or simply a gap in information in their supply chain, using non-disclosure agreements as to the nature of the supply chain as well as the information, is a Works can go back several steps in the supply chain, gather the chemical data your supplier wasn't able to get, put the whole package together, all under non-disclosure agreements, and again, a Walmart or whoever is using that information gets the top line, yeah, there's a hazard or there's not a hazard problem. The other is, again, whether it's HBD or a number of others, common data requests so the companies know what to expect and know how to provide information. that helps a lot in breaking down both CBI barriers and having more understandable information. And then you want to assure your CDA, the CDA between you and your supplier, says for the supplier, okay, this information is going to be kept secret. But it says to the supplier, because you're going to build this into the CDA, if I can find this information from a public source, if you release it in some other way, if it's simple reverse engineering, the CDA is void because it's really not secret information. So it protects both parties. But at the same time, if you're dealing with a supplier who is really a new product, a new material, it's important to be able to show that you have the ability to protect that information or that your third party has that ability. So finally, we get back to employing available incentives. That's the last step. These are all things that the group looked at and said these are some of the issues where we think we can make some progress in dealing with CBA and facilitating supply chain passage of information. And those get back to a lot of things we talked about before, which is that the information is drawn through the system by the suppliers, the incentive, the leverage of the suppliers in scoring a product and demanding information. Those are all key things, and they're key things whether or not the product, the chemical is covered by CBI or the product is covered by CBI. Just wanted to make sure, one of the bottom lines that the group generally agreed on, I won't say it was unanimous, it wasn't, was that health and safety information about ingredients should always be shared between businesses without non-disclosure agreement. And that's also what's basically in the Health Product Declaration, again, if you look at that. So what are some of the lessons for increasing the flow and transparency? First, customer demand is the critical driver. And that demand comes from the interaction between the customer's sense of things, what they're trying to accomplish, some regulations, and the impact of NGOs and groups like this one. Collaboration between companies and other organizations is more and more crucial to making these changes. The supply chains are so long, so complex, even the largest companies can't do it on their own. Third, the big thing is that it's not just a sector. The electronic sector took the lead on this. It's all sectors across a whole range of commerce interacting, having similar requirements, which is driving a lot of this change. And so every step, like the materials declaration that you're doing, materials declarations that other sectors are requiring, forces suppliers and multiple supply chains to respond because there are cross links between a lot of these. And finally, CBI, both CBI and non-CBI data is facilitated by the combined impact of this. It's not just whether something's CBI. Some things are marginally CBI. Company thinks maybe it's CBI. The whole issue of will releasing this information have a market impact? Well, government can require that you demonstrate this. If it's in a business context, it's on faith. I mean, the company, the supplier says this will have a severe impact on us if we release it. How do you challenge that? Oh, basically you don't, unless you have enough market power to twist their arms. So all these changes that make flow easier get information to flow generally, whether it's information under CBI or non-CBI, gets information about chemicals to flow where we may not know a hazard is there now, but we discover it, so we have the information on what's out there. And finally, use of tools is really critical, whether it's green screen, whether it's simple chemical tracking tools and hazard tracking tools from companies that provide that service, Cyvera, or there are a number that are out there. Actually, we're doing an assessment of some of that right now because a lot of the medium-sized companies we deal with are still at the Excel spreadsheet level, and they're sort of wrestling with that problem, and they need to know what kind of information is available, how they can get better control of their data. So finally, for any of you who are fans of Alice in Wonderland, this is from Through the Looking Glass, and Red Queen is running very fast, and Alice is struggling to keep up with her and says, but we're not going anywhere, we're staying in the same place. And in our country, if you run this fast, you get somewhere else. And the Queen responds, that's a very slow kind of country. In our country, you have to run very fast just to stay in the same place. So I think we're getting to the point where we can get off the treadmill. We're really beginning to have real progress. The companies that are going to stay on the treadmill, that are going to be in the red-green situation, are the companies that fail to adopt to the changes that are happening and to respond to it. And the message is going back to the supply chain is you don't want to be in the situation of the red queen. Thank Yeah, if you're a company like Seagate, you're asking for the full disclosure of the chemicals that are in the products, and then you will make the hazard assessment yourself if that's what you're going to do. I think increasingly companies are recognizing that the hazard assessment is something they need to deal with because that's where a lot of the focus is. Of course, risk is still, I mean, obviously risk is hazard plus exposure. But the real question becomes, what do we know about exposure? And depending on the nature of the product, that's going to vary. And of course, we also all know the denials that get into here or the inability to deal with things. I was struck something I read just a while ago that prohibition on lead in paints was undertaken by several European countries as early as 1909. Think about that. It didn't happen here until the 1970s, and think of all the disasters that happened to children as a result of that. So there are long-term resistances to change based on refusal to recognize exposure problems or lack of understanding of exposure problems. I mean, one of the issues with that comes up in terms of medical products, in terms of DEHP and medical equipment, a blood bag or whatever, is DEHP is a plasticizer, it's a phthalate, which is a plasticizer for PVC to keep it flexible. And so in blood bags and a lot of the equipment that is used for hospitals, for injections, whatever, you have DEHP in PVC to make it workable. And PVC, and that it works really well, but the DEHP isn't necessarily totally locked in. And for very sensitive populations, children who are born, premature children, or people who are having heart surgery or whatever, things that are very sensitive, we're really not sure whether there's a problem or not because there is migration of the DEHP, something which wasn't recognized. You'll still see some denials that it happens, but scientifically it happens. The question becomes, is it a problem or not? And if we're looking at it from a precautionary point of view, well, do we want to wait because one of the things you'll still read in some of the comments is, well, we haven't seen human health problems resulting from this. Well, yeah, but we've seen animal studies which indicate there may be. That's where the exposure issue comes in. And so hazard, where there's a potential for exposure, it seems to me you want to go towards hazard. And I think a lot of companies are recognizing that, which is not to say all. There have been, all the battles on that.
Hi, this is Ashley White.
Hi, Ashley.
Joining you remotely from California. So I had a question about, essentially what a lot of companies are doing right now is this more red list approach to things, checking off that they don't have any chemicals that are on some regulatory list or something like that. And I'm wondering, to what extent that in your experience, you've seen any situations where that's causing regrettable substitutions because essentially, there aren't that many people going for full assessments right now. And I know, for a big company like Walmart or something, requiring full assessments of all of its products would be quite challenging. So I don't know if you could speak to this idea in general of red list versus full assessments.
Obviously, the red list is a starting point. It says you don't have certain chemicals that are on that list, and it's sort of the bare minimum hazard approach if you want to avoid having the hazards. It does lead you to the potential for regrettable substitutions. Well, it's not maybe a major example in terms of reality. We did a study 2-3 years ago for Maine. Maine had a prohibition against using DECA, the brominated flame retardant, in products in homes. And they also then had a secondary rule which they applied to pallets, which are used for moving products. You know, they're used hundreds of thousands of them, move products all over the country. Most of them are wood, but there was a company which had developed plastic pallets, and plastic burns hotter than wood. So the pallet company had to put in something as a flame retardant. They used DECA. And so Maine asked for an assessment of whether are there substitutes that would be better than DECA. And in the course of discussions with the company, with other companies that were looking into this, what came up as substitutes were often equally bad actors that just hadn't been on the radar yet. We ended up deciding that wood was probably better than plastic in this case, because even though plastic was lighter and you had some advantages in terms of greenhouse gases, energy use, and things like that, there was no way of getting around the use of a hazardous flame retardant without putting, there were a couple that worked, but you had to make a heavy enough plastic pallet that you had no advantage over the wood. So the unfortunate substitute was the idea we were going to move from this DECA flame retardant to another one which was equally bad but wasn't on anybody's hit list yet. And that can happen with red listing. I think, however, that what you look at, if you look at something like the IEC questionnaire for companies that are using that, which is, think of it sort of like the health product declaration, but it's in the electrical, like making toasters or other kinds of electrical equipment like that. The first threshold you go through is comparing against the red list they have. And then the second threshold is, if you want to go beyond that, sort of a tiered approach, you can begin to look at the other chemicals and start making assessments of them. You could use green screen or whatever. So the question is, how far do you go? The red list is okay to start. Obviously, in the long term, that's not where we want to see people end up. Is that, Ashley?
Yeah. Okay. It does, and as a follow-up to that, I don't know if you're familiar with the 6 classes approach that Arlene Bloom's Green Science Policy Institute has been working on. Have you heard of that at all?
Say that again. I didn't.
It's called the 6 classes approach.
No, I'm not familiar with that.
So essentially what it is, I just spent last week in the mountains outside of Santa Cruz at a toxic reduction retreat that Arlene Bloom put on. And essentially what her group is doing is, I call it along the lines of a categorized red list of sorts. So there are categories of chemicals that one should try to avoid, like the flame retardants, like water and stain repellents, like a wide swath of solvents, things like that. And the idea is that, it's still in some senses a red list because it's a list of, it's groups of things you should avoid, but it is trying to get a step further towards at least categorizing them so you have it flagged in your mind. You might not want to substitute just one flame retardant for another one.
Right.
And I'm curious, maybe you're hearing about this approach for the first time, but do you think it would have, particular more merit than the more simple, uncategorized red list approach?
Yeah, I like that approach. It's actually the same approach that's used by the Zero Discharge Hazardous Chemicals Group for clothing, in that there are 11 families of chemicals, chlorinated solvents, for example, which are to be excluded from use. So it's not a matter of picking a particular solvent, saying don't use that one, or a list of solvents. It says that family of solvents we're not going to use down the line. So yeah, I've seen that approach. I haven't heard that label before, but if you could send me the link to that, I'd like to look. But I think that approach is being used. Well, I think the leverage, we won't call it force, the leverage comes from the fact if your customer requires you to provide information and requires you to eliminate use of certain materials, you may not use the word force, but there's certainly some force there. If your customer is large enough to have an impact that you have to do it. You want to be in the market, you've got to do this. So I don't think any of the large companies doing this would refer to it as forcing. What their focus is, if it's a seventh generation, is there's a certain quality of product we want to maintain. And if any of these materials are in what comes to us, we can't do that. So we won't accept those materials, and we will toxicologically assess everything that comes to us and make sure that it meets our standards. So if you're selling seventh generation, you have to do that. For SC Johnson, the same thing with the scoring under the green list. These aren't things where you're saying you're forcing a company. What you're doing is you're saying, here are the standards that we want to reach. Here are the kinds of materials we don't want in our products or we don't want to sell. And therefore, that means suppliers have to comply with that. Again, we don't know what the 10 chemical classes are that Walmart, I mean, we can guess. I've got some ideas, but we don't know exactly what they are. But we do know that if you're a supplier to Walmart, you're going to be looking very carefully now at how you do research to get out of those materials, how you reformulate your products so that come 2018, you won't have the equivalent of a cigarette label on the product you're selling at Walmart. So if the company is large enough for that sector, obviously Seagate isn't the size of Walmart, but in its sector, it's very important, then it has that kind of leverage over the supply chain. And suppliers are going to start looking, they're going to do one of two things. They're either going to start reformulating the product so that they're in that market, or they're going to say, you know, that customer just isn't worth having. Now, that can be a short-term solution, or for a very niche customer, that may be a solution. But if you're looking at the longer-term market, what you have to look at is say, right now, we could avoid making that change. But which other customers are going to be making that requirement 10 years down the road, 5 years down the road, 2 years down the road? Kaiser Permanente doesn't allow PVCs in the same kind of hospital equipment. It's unusual right now. It's as a company that won't allow that, but how many other companies are going to be moving in that direction? So if you're a supplier for that equipment, what are you going to look at in terms of your long-term market? No, maybe that is going to be, maybe the standard is going to be non-DEHP PVCs. Who knows? But those are judgments, market business judgments companies have to make in light of the questions or the requirements they're getting from their customers. Sure. What green screen does is make readily available a method which was used by Design for the Environment originally to provide safer alternatives for materials being used in products. Design for the Environment obviously has limited internal capabilities to do that, provide that for particular companies, and also their focus is largely in specific sectors. Green Screen, by taking that as a starting point and really building a publicly available system, and with companies that are, I think it's NSF, Tox Services, I'm not sure if I think there may be a couple others that can actually use that tool. Companies are also developing the internal capabilities themselves to use that tool. So they're able to do alternative assessments that they couldn't have imagined doing realistically 5 or 10 years ago. And I think as that tool becomes more widely used, as the results of Green Screen become publicly available for particular chemicals, it's going to provide a level of information and insight into chemicals and hazards and alternatives that can be out there safely that we wouldn't have dreamed of a decade ago. There are a small number of places where that's happening now that'll be in SEC reports and so on. I don't know that I've seen a lot of that. I've seen about 3 or 4 companies that are really exceptions, and I don't know, it's been more The ones I've seen have been more on the level of greenhouse gas emissions and water problems and things like that. But I think that's going to happen over time. I think it's beginning. Yeah, yeah,
Oh, hi.
yeah. Hi.
This is Ann Whitaker. I'm with HOK. I'm the specification writer here, and one of the things that I hear the most frequently from suppliers is that now that there's been a multi-year drive to ask people to use recycled content, they no longer know what's in their recycled content. We've had steel studs, for example, that had nuclear material that came out of recycled steel from East Germany, back when East Germany existed. And so what we end up with, if you have a declaration, is that it's essentially meaningless. The manufacturer can't vouch for the content of the material. They're buying basic materials at the spot price on a daily basis from international sources. And when I look at an HPD, it doesn't mean anything to me.
Yeah, the recycled material issue in plastics and a lot of other materials is clearly a major problem because we don't, since the materials come unexamined, combined in different ways, it's really hard to know for sure what's in them. I know that's a major problem. I wish I had the miracle answer for it, but at the moment I don't. But I think that's an issue we're going to have to address. I think it's really an important point because we're obviously interested in promoting recycling, and yet there's this counter problem right now in terms of what materials are in the recycled materials, what kind of contaminants.
Yeah, so I had another question around the motivations that different companies would have for disclosing or for screening their products. And you talked about that the consumer can drive things. You also talked about regulation driving things, certifications, avoiding lawsuits. And I guess I'm wondering, like, the customer can mean a lot of things. And of course, I think the customer, the customer might be the retailer buying from a supplier. The customer, can mean a lot of different things in the building industry. And I think that, our industry is perhaps quite different from, Walmart's industry. And I'm wondering what customers have different pushes and pulls at the moment with the industry. And in particular, say, when you talk about customers having pull, are you seeing at this point, for instance, in working with Walmart, that number one, is the average Walmart shopper actually educated enough and demanding information about their products? Do you see any movement towards this? Because I think across all industries, getting the average everyday person who is occupying a building or who is shopping at Walmart to care about these things is really important. And I'm just curious how you see this moving forward, what we can do to educate consumers of all natures.
That's really a good point. I think right now the pressure does not directly come largely from consumers. Certainly, if you think of I haven't seen data on this, but my impression from what I have seen is no, it's not coming from the buyer at Walmart. Where consumer pressure will come is where there are products which have been heavily, there's been heavy communication in the press, media, whatever, about a problem with a particular type of product. BPA was an example of this. BPA vanished because consumers wouldn't buy BPA products because there was so much publicity about it. But that's a particular type of product, a particular chemical. Generally speaking, outside of those sort of key health issues that are heavily publicized, I don't think the drive comes from the consumers. I think, however, it comes from a couple of things. I think from the point of view of the company, it's a matter that they know that there is, first of all, the NGOs who can be seen as representing consumers to some extent certainly are tracking this very heavily. And the reputation of a company can depend on that quality. The effect of Greenpeace on the brands in apparel industry was that they actually tested clothing and found formaldehyde and other things, residuals on the clothing, and they advertise that. Now, how many consumers really were aware of it, focus on it? Maybe not that many, but the pressure on the companies certainly was significant in terms of their concern, in terms of their stakeholders, their stockholders even. So there are lots of things that motivate a company. In the case of Walmart, there are so many negatives you can hear about Walmart, and certainly you go back a decade ago and before they got into sustainability, the negatives were predominant. So there were two things that happened, I think, if you look at the history of Walmart. First, that you had a senior executive level, and this is crucial. It has to be at the senior executive level for something like this to drive a large company, who thought this was really important. They took it as a value. And second, that there is a sense that they can become market leaders and perhaps attract positive attention on what they're doing because of that positive. Think of the green products that were sold by Clorox. That's still a tiny part of Clorox, but it did have an impact on Clorox's image. So it's the perceived long-term consumer interest and of the sensitive, the people like the people in this room or online here who follow this kind of thing, that they are opinion shapers to some degree. The belief of, in some cases, senior executives in some companies, and you can think of several of them who believe in this themselves and so push their companies that way. There are a lot of factors. I don't think this is a consumer-driven movement yet, though I think that can come.
Okay, so hey Ashley, I think we're gonna drive to a close because we've had great questions in the room. I wanted to make one closing observation and then challenge you with one closing question. And so, I mean, I think that one of the reasons we wanted to have Bob here and offer his perspective on supply chains was this is obviously kind of one of those out of industry examples, but I think what was really critical is for us to understand, as Bob repeatedly pointed out, that we as the building sector are part of a broader movement, and to understand that actually, first off, that we are not leading that movement. At best, we are participating in that movement. So if there is any confusion in our supply chain, it was our decision makers to understand that no, we're not like on the radical fringe of this. Actually, we are somewhere in the middle, and probably it might be fair to say that doing anything less than we are currently doing would be not keeping up. And so I think it's important to put our own experience in the building sector, regardless of the challenges that we have faced dealing with this issue. We are not some sort of, we're not making this up on our own. We are part of this broader conversation. So one thing that came out of, we had the privilege of staying with Bob and a number of others in Chicago a couple weeks ago. And one of the questions that came up at the end that was not kind of articulated to the room was, when we look at the future, the vision, kind of almost the end game of this pursuit of more transparency, the pursuit of intrinsically safer supply chain, one of the questions is, are we going to arrive at a point where we have ubiquitous information, where every product is labeled in a way that the decision maker can understand the hazards and maybe the risks involved in that product? Or are we going to end up in a state where such labels are intrinsically not needed because the supply chain has adapted to remove those risks from their own products? So in other words, we end up with labeling being the end state where there's still hazardous chemicals, but you have a label that maybe you can understand? Or do you end up in a state where labels are just, if we go out 10 years, they're not so important, products are just safer because these things have been worked through? Do you have an opinion or a perspective on where we end up?
Some of both. I mean, I think there's some basic products where you'll be able to say, and maybe in the food area particularly, that, okay, if you buy it from this location that has its commitments, the products are going to be safe. But if, in terms of the nirvana suggestion, I don't think we get there for a couple reasons. First, we're always developing new materials with new characteristics. We don't know when we first develop those, when we first put them out in the market necessarily, what the impacts are going to be. You can do the assessments up front. We get into this in vengeance with nanomaterials. You can do the assessments up front, but to some extent you don't know till you're out there using the material, you discover we never anticipated this. There are those effects that you can't predict. So we don't get to a situation where you don't need to know what the materials are, because there are always going to be conflicts in judgments over the hazard versus risk issue and whether these materials pose risks. And that's going to be a debate. And so to answer that question, you need to have the information. And secondly, as I say, you're always going to have transformative materials, and some will seem great initially, and then you discover the thing you didn't expect.
Good.